All right, guys, so let's go over speed painting in this one. Some of you are curious how I come up with images like this. It's really easy. It's a lot of fun, but let me kind of walk you through the process. And we're going to do a more proper process than even this. So that way you have a better understanding of how to achieve things like this, at least. What I'm doing here is really just all over the place. They're thumbnail quality speed paints. They're not finalized illustrations or nothing like that. Just a starting off point for myself to get something like this going. It takes about 30 minutes. It's really fun. But it's all done on one layer. It's not split apart like it should be. And so we're going to play around with the splitting of things up anyways. But you can see, very cool, very fun to do. You know, you can block things in very fast, basically. Come up with really cool ideas. And play around with perspectives and see if you can make really interesting perspectives, perhaps. All right, so let me get out of all these real quick, and then we'll go ahead and start a new document. Now, new document, I'm just going to use US letter for now, landscape, 2 layers, fill as a gray background, mid-gray, RGB, 8-bit, all that fun stuff. Now, we need to talk about the tools a lot because tools help you achieve these kinds of things, right? So first up, there's kind of 2 flavors of brushes. And once you start looking at your brushes this way, you'll probably never look at them any way different. So first being, we have hard edges and we have soft edges, okay? When you're speed painting anything, let me do a little selection here. When you're speed painting anything, more than likely, you're going to end up moving into shading rather fast. Maybe not initially, not right away, but rather fast you might start doing shading. So like a soft round brush in this area, for example, we can create something like so. Now, I'm pointing this out because when you're doing line art, you're sketching, you're drawing, or whatever the case, a lot of times you're creating little edges like this, and these are parallel edges. There's 2 sides to it, right? But meanwhile, when you're creating a big shape overall and you're shading it, you're only creating usually one edge. So this is the way a lot of things work in photography. There might be occasionally times where you have 2 parallel edges. It's not like it doesn't happen, but a lot of times you're going to end up with a single edge and a gradient of some sort. I have to point that out. You have to learn how to control things and create gradients, basically, is the main thing here. When you're doing selections, creating any kind of a selection, you can hold Shift and you can add to a selection. You can hold Alt and subtract from a selection. So you can create holes or whatever else you need to create in order to make the shapes that you want. And generally, you can fill these by pressing F on a new layer. You can do a quick fill like this, right? But we can run into an issue. Like, let's say we did this and then we start shading it right off the bat. And then we use a Blender blur brush, right? And let's say we turn the opacity on this so it tends to, it's actually a smudger. It'll tend to blur more now as opposed to smudge. And so if we do that, you see like something's going on here. It's turning transparent because there's no pixels out here. Okay, so that's one of the issues you'll run into. And to solve this problem here, we either A, don't use the blur brush, or B, we can create what's called a clipping group. So if we take this layer with it selected, right, we don't need the selection like so. And we can go ahead and take this and Control Shift G on it. We'll create a clipping group. Okay, clipping group is a group, has a bottom layer like so. That's a solid fill, generally speaking. And this one here is going to be an inheriting alpha. So when we turn that on and off, we'll get kind of a clipping effect, basically. So we can go through, we could do some shading like this real quick. We're overextending past the bounds. And then we can turn that on and we'll get this result. See how that works? So we're actually going across the whole area as a layer. Okay, that's the main thing. So now when we need to soften something, we can blur it with the Blender blur brush real quick, and we can do that. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's just one way of controlling things to a higher level. You're going to work in layers as needed on your projects, and you're going to create, you know, the layers that you need, like background, midground, foreground, generally speaking. But you might want to block it out first and create your solid fills, and then create clipping groups and work with things in little groups, basically. So next thing I want to talk about real quick is that let's talk about traditional art just for a moment. Now, digital art is definitely, it's not traditional art, right? Like it's something different, but there's some approaches in traditional art that work in digital as well, or it helps you build up the idea of how to use the tools in digital. So a lot of times when someone is working on a project on canvas, and they're going to do what's called like an acrylic painting. They're going to do an initial lay-in of the composition. They might sketch with like a pencil or something like that, right? They might start coming up with their idea, filling out the whole canvas with whatever it might be. They might actually draw on paper first, create a thumbnail there, and then try to transfer that thumbnail to the canvas as a sketch. And then they'll start working on the painting itself after sketching on the canvas, right? This is something that's quite common. It happens not only with acrylics, but like watercolors and things like that as well. So a lot of times they do the little sketch with pencil is very faint. You can hardly see it. And then what they do is they use a watered down or transparent acrylic paint. So you can put in like clear medium to the paint. And that's the equivalent of opacity is clear paint. Okay, so that's the main idea. And once you understand this, it becomes a lot easier to work with opacity, because opacity is a little weird at first when you don't understand this. But what'll happen is once they start working on the picture, they'll do what's called an underpainting, right? A lot of times they do what's called an underpainting, where it's just very transparent or thin paint at least. And they're going to go over the sketch or the drawing and start doing an initial lay-in of various colors, basically, or values even. Like you can do things in black and white. You don't have to do it in color necessarily. But they're going to go in and they're going to start laying out some paint on top of that sketch, and it will look something like this. Okay, so one of the important things to recognize is the difference between painting layers and digital layers, right? So when you're painting, every time you put down some paint, if all that paint is wet, you can do what's called wet blending. But when the layer dries, it's going to dry into it's a layer. Well, that's why they're known as layers. So when you're using something like opacity, and every time you do a brush stroke, it's like instantly dry paint. It's creating a layer more or less in the traditional sense. Okay, so it's a little hard to work with that sometimes when you don't understand what it's doing or how it's working, because you're not creating new layers like this per se. And the effect of just using a digital brush, you have to just do the whole piece at one time, the whole layer, and then it's dry, right? Like as soon as you let the brush up. So the other way around that would be just to do like a solid opacity and then lay down whatever you need to lay down real quick and then turn the opacity lower, right? That's the equivalent of a layer as well. So you would just create, like every new brush stroke is basically creating a layer, doing something like that, right? You get the idea? Okay, so I just want to point this out because what you're going to find is that traditional artists often work this way, right? Like they're doing these transparent paints, and they're going to start building up their image. They're going to do the background at the same time. And they have different ways of working. Like sometimes they do background to foreground, sometimes they do foreground to background. But ultimately, this is what they're going to end up doing. They're just going to start building up the idea of the image. They're going to use different colors that they see fit. And they're going to slowly start to work up in values, or work down in values, should I say, because it's easier to make corrections on light layers than if you're to do everything in like really strong, like black per se, right? Like it's very hard to repair this because you have to use like pure white paint in order to get it to turn back to a lighter value. And the white it's like transparent almost always. Like certain paints are very, they're not very opaque. So like yellows and whites being two of the main culprits. You have to use lots and lots of layers to repair something basically, right? And so that's not what you want to do. You want to work usually light to dark as well. The same can be true in other types of traditional arts, like using markers, for example. You might want to work light to dark perhaps there as well, unless you want to be very decisive with your dark markings. That's what would happen. So traditionally, I encourage a lot of people to try traditional artwork just to see how it compares to digital, but we're working digital. We don't have to do all that, right? So here's where the fun begins. Let's do Bob Ross for a minute, all right? We're going to do the Bob Ross style. Like say if we were doing a landscape, Bob Ross usually throws on liquid white to the canvas, and it just loosens everything up. So it's like, it's all, it's going to be wet, right? The whole canvas will be wet basically. So you can do wet blending. And with his brushes, he's kind of doing something interesting. He's normally doing, he's using one brush to lay down the kind of colors that he wants. And then with the other brush, it's completely dry. There's no paint in it. And he's using that to blend. That's the equivalent of using a smudger, right? So even if you were using like charcoal or chalk or soft pastels, you can use like your finger, or even pencil sketching. You can use your finger to smudge, right? That's one of those things that you can do. And it's really useful when you're trying to create really soft effects. So it's important to recognize when you're doing skies, you might have like the horizon being a little bit brighter, and different lighting solutions or different lighting in the scene will dictate like what happens with your sky a lot of times on how it's going to look, or how you're going to set up the values here, the brightness values. But the main idea is you create something like a horizon, right? And then what Bob Ross does later on is he grabs a palette knife and he chisels into things and he starts creating a mountain or something, right? And he's going to do this number and he creates like low level fog a lot of times. And you get where we're going with this now, right? So the airbrush or the soft round brush here in Krita is super useful in this sense, because now we can just start to play around with these ideas and do this kind of masking technique. When you see those guys painting at like fairgrounds or flea markets or wherever you end up going, they're using spray paint and newspaper and little coffee cups and mugs and stuff like that, coffee cans. And they're just doing these like speed art, celestial paintings or whatever. A lot of times that's what they're doing. They're masking. So masking tools are super useful, because like if I do a circle, you know, I can come in here and hit this with like bright white, you know, no problem. If I wanted to go around it, I can do that. Okay. And so, you know, do it on a new layer if you wanted to, but the selection helps you do that. That's the same idea as using that coffee can, right? So Control-Shift-I, you invert that selection. So now everything out here, now we can do other things like that, right? So that's how they create those like moon effects and things like that. It's all about just controlling the layering of things. And when you need to mask something, you need to mask something, and so on and so forth, right? Very easy. Once you start looking at things this way, all the magic of art starts to break down a little bit. It's very easy to do. Now, when you're watching these guys doing concept thumbnails, right? A lot of times they're working in values, and they're doing like foreground elements, midground elements. They're working in these values like this, black and white, generally speaking. They might be creating all kinds of different crazy compositions. We're going to keep ours kind of simple here, but you get the idea. They're doing things like this. They're doing like a dark value for the foreground, more like a mid-gray for the midground. And if I just tap that there and bring it out to this side, I can use a fill bucket too. You see how we get that extra line? Grow it by one, click again, maybe a couple times if you need to. Boom, it's gone, okay? So do be aware that when you're using any of these tools and you have anti-aliasing check, you can end up with that little effect where something's left over. You might have to correct that out. But the main idea is that we can get in here, and now we got like a breakup of a scene potentially happening, right? Let's take it a step further. Let's create a new layer in a hard round brush. This one's just a really thin hard round brush. So I'm going to hold V and hold Shift, and we can start to create perhaps like a vanishing point, right? And this is going to be a perspective guide. So if you're not confident in drawing in perspective, or even if you are, you should use a perspective guide at some point or another. It's just going to help you keep things a little bit more accurate. And when you're speed painting, this can be extremely useful. Something you can do in digital that you can't get away with in traditional, right? So it's one of those things. You should take advantage of it. Now, when we drop this down, we still have the perspective guide. It should be on our horizon somewhere, and so on and so forth, right? But when we're blocking things out, we're using a very opaque brush right now. We're not worrying about opacity and all that. But if we wanted to create like buildings, you can see where this starts to go, right? Like we can just start laying out lines like this. If we enclose the shape, we can just use the fill bucket, knock it out, right? So we can start to create buildings and all kinds of different cool, interesting ideas. Maybe this is a factory or something, okay? Now your brushes themselves, when it comes to the brush tips, you can use circles, squares, triangles, ellipses, whatever. We can use any kind of brush tip we want. But even texture brushes are going to come in those two flavors. They're usually either kind of like a harder texture or a softer texture. When you look at your texture, when you click it in, if it's sharp and it's a bunch of little shapes or lines or edges or dots, that's going to be a sharp texture, okay? That's all I'm pointing out there, is even texture brushes are sharp or soft, generally speaking. Sometimes you can be in the middle where you have like a medium hardness. And actually that's what this brush is. And that's why we got those bad anti-aliasing lines as well. But the main idea is like we can create a factory perhaps, right? And if we wanted to be more precise with this to some degree, like we can copy things, paste them. So you just do a lasso select, copy, paste. Maybe I just want to go ahead and bring this down and change the size a little bit. We can create repetition as well if we needed to, right? So if we needed 2 smokestacks, we go along with the perspective. We're only doing 1-point perspective right now, so it's not the most interesting, but you do need to learn to draw in perspective. You need to know your art fundamentals, Control E to merge those 2 layers. But you need to learn how to do all that, where you're working with just extreme kind of like perspective things. Because Like imagine if you're rendering a reflective sphere, right? That's like mirror quality and it's reflecting the whole environment, or it's something like, it was MC Escher or somebody that did that whole sphere thing that was real popular. Right. You can draw those kinds of things out if you start to understand how to use guides, basically. Even something like an equirectangular map, when you're used to working with HDRI images, you can actually render an HDRI image drawn in a 2D editing program. The only problem you're going to suffer on, or the only part that you would have an issue with, is working usually the tops and the bottoms of the HDRI. But the rest of it's very easy to do once you start to learn how to use those grids. And so you can look up an HDRI grid if you want to practice working on it, but and then throw it into Blender, like right in the environment if you needed to just kind of look at it, preview it. But we got this kind of set up and going. So this is great because now, let's turn that off for a sec. We can do contiguous selections, set our threshold to whatever we need, anti-alias it if you want. But you can see I can select this whole area, right? And this is what's cool. I can select different areas like this, and I can go to layer, new layer, and just cut selection to new layer. Boom. Just like that, done. Go back to the original here, select this one, layer, and we can do layer, new layer, cut selection to new layer. So we have these groups now, or these different layers that we've separated. Midground, foreground. So foreground should be top, midground, background. Generally speaking, is usually the way it goes. I'm going to turn all these off for just a moment. So you can see we got some like leftovers here taking place on this one. I'm just going to delete that real quick. Now this is that, this is that, this is that. Okay. Our background is here. It's solid, so we're good on that one. We're not going to worry about that one. This one here, though, we might run into a little bit of issues with. We want to take this and continue past the other layers. Okay. Like you don't have to take it all the way out to the sides or anything like that necessarily. I tend to typically do this, but you want to be careful when you're cutting it up, basically. That's all you're trying to do. This one over here should be fine. We shouldn't have any major issues with that one. And now we got our perspective guide. Okay. So really easy to separate these. And these can become clipping groups if you want. So if you just Control-Shift-G them, and, oh, not the perspective guide. Background, we're going to unlock and Control-Shift-G as well. All right. So that way we just have like the base fill, and then we have the shading layer that we're going to work on. All right. That's the easiest way to deal with it. Now we can use things like soft round brushes, perhaps. The background is going to be very light, right? Usually knit down near the horizon. So you can see where this starts to work out. Like we can do things like this, right? And create like atmospheric haze or fog or effects like that. Later on, we can do it in a little bit in the foreground as well, where we create like low level fogs and stuff. But for now, we're not going to worry about it. Then on the next one, we're doing, did I not clipping group it? I guess I did not. Okay, we're going to do that then. This one, like say we use a pressure sensitive opacity brush, right? So this, we're going to try to stay near this gray level. Okay, that's the main thing. And using a specific color selector, so settings, Docker's specific color selector, change it from HSV or whatever, or RGB to HSV. Okay, you can try other ones if you want, I guess. But the main thing is that when we control click, we select the color here, we can just bump it up, maybe a stop, you know, like a little bit lighter. You're not trying to do these to the extremes just yet. A lot of times you're just trying to figure out, you know, how you're going to set up breakup of these shapes. And you can see we don't go off the silhouette now. So we're able to start working in this manner where we can just start to figure out our breakup of this area on how we're going to do it anyways. And we can control click in here, find that gray value. If we ever lose it, we can go back to the base layer. And now we can just kind of work freely and just figure out what we're doing here. All right. If we like that it's gray value, we can make it darker, or if we wanted to, perhaps. Eventually what we do is we start to increase the contrast in this area. So it's not that you stay dark the whole time. It's dark in the shadows usually is what the case is. So like you can do very bright things in here at some point, potentially. You think of like a mirror being out in the distance reflecting on the sun or something. It would create like a little white glow there. It'd be like a really bright spot. So that's why you can get away with using bright values. But generally when things go back in the atmosphere, they become less and less saturated, right? But occasionally things do pop through that. So it's one of those things that as you look at reference images and you start to work off these ideas, you can really start to create just really cool stuff, but you have to have a momentum to it and you have to kind of keep moving, right? And if you feel like you're like, if you don't work on this silhouette part, you should work the most on this silhouette part. Creating really interesting silhouettes is going to drive the whole image for the most part. But, you know, if you start spending a lot of time playing around with shading and trying to make things look more better with the shading, sometimes that's a downside because it means more brush work a lot of times. And it's not always the greatest thing to do. But it does take time to fully render something as well. So just keep that in mind. You're going to spend some time on it, right? You can hit R and you can click on things as long as you don't have like a big effect layer in front of everything. So like if we do this number like this, we get into this mid ground here now, we can just, I want to maybe work it a little bit darker as it comes towards us a little bit, just so that it kind of stays consistent like that. And then towards the background, it can be a little bit lighter perhaps, right? So we can also separate this one again as well, maybe make the building separate. That's something that could happen. But this is oftentimes why those images that I showed at the start there, they're very rough. It's because I'm not trying to get too caught up in doing a bunch of layers yet. Usually I try to keep my layers real simple when working on it like this. And then just go to town and have a little bit of fun, but not getting caught up in everything right off the bat, right? So, you know, I can get in here, I can start laying things in, I can start figuring out where I'm going to place a door, if I want to do windows, like where those might exist. You see where we're going on this, like, so I can do all kinds of composition guides for myself on this because I can just quickly control, sample, and paint them back out. So I can always figure out what I'm trying to do and achieve. That door maybe is too big, and so on and so forth, right? And then now maybe I want to darken this side of the building a little bit. You get where I'm going with that? And you can see I messed up the horizon over there, or that other little shape over there. Okay. We could probably split that into layers later on if we needed to. I want to try to bring that down a little, I think. Maybe make that like a distant... Oh, I was going to try to make it a distant mountain, but I'd have to turn the alpha lock off just for a moment and fix that if I did. So we won't mess with it right now. But that's the main idea. And you can see how this goes. We could create new layers and work on these as well. Let's say we use a hard round brush real quick. Do a color sample in here. We can even use like a dark value if we wanted to. And we could just do a drawing out from the horizon out to here. We just want to make sure that this either continues all the way through to the end of the canvas, or we enclose this shape when we work on it so we can fill it, right? Now I'm going to pull it down just a little bit to get it off the horizon like it was. And I can drop the opacity, okay? So we're blocking in. This is what, basically, before you start doing all the shading and stuff, you're blocking in these big ideas first. You're working on those silhouettes. Usually this is the better way of going because you can always add detail later. You don't want to get caught up in a bunch of detail and have something like the building being too small or something like that, right? And so you work in this manner where you start stacking things up, and it can be quite good, basically. And it goes further than this as well. Like if I create another layer, you know, later on, I'm like, you know, I need a light pole that sits out here somewhere in this area. Maybe I just silhouette it out first because I'm not worried about the shading just yet. And I know it's going to go straight to the left, right? And so we create like a little light pole or something. And it's going to be off to the side of the road. You see where we're going with this now? So eventually we can take this and using the rules of perspective and all that, we can just say, you know, we're going to push this further and further back into the background perhaps. You can see now it looks too large. Okay, so we need to go ahead and tweak this, make sure this is in alignment, this is in alignment, and we can make this more appropriate now, right? So working these kinds of things out from the start in layers is super useful. It's just going to keep you from making a bunch of really bad errors or mistakes. It's just something nice to do, right? So later on, maybe we collapse all those together. How they're ending up, I think some are in a group and some aren't. Yeah, that's weird. All right, well, let's pull them out of the group and then Control E all those together. You can shift click them to select them all. We can keep going further into the background if we wanted to. But basically, you can do like a detailed one real quick and then just repeat it down. Don't have to detail all of them necessarily. You might modify them or change them a bit, but that's about all you're going to end up doing. And so this one, we can also, if we don't want to do a clipping group, we can just alpha lock it, or excuse me, yeah, alpha lock it. We could just go through, do that real quick, and then maybe take the values down on these a little bit, right? As they go further into the background, just airbrushing onto them. So we're not using a clipping group, we're just going straight with the airbrush. Good enough, right? We can do things like that. We still have tons of filters we can use, right? So if you're ever working, you want to use things like blur, Gaussian blur, adjust levels, HSV adjustments, all of that's free to use. You can do that. Later on, you can do your color solution, or later on, you can do like a layer and set it maybe to color. Your color is going to be mostly about saturation or the tone. So left to right, that's your saturation, right? Tone. If you use something that's very, very vivid, it's going to be very vivid. If it's not very vivid, it's going to be less. Okay. It doesn't really care about value up and down. Like you can see, like it doesn't really influence it at all. It's just going to be kind of the same deal, right? Okay, so you can do color, and there's all kinds of color arrangements. We're not going to get into it in this video, but basically the main idea is that, you know, if you want to use a color layer later and just go through and start coloring things, you can see that's too bright, too saturated. You'll be surprised how many, like when you're doing photographs of like real world things, or you're trying to create photorealism, it's not very vivid a lot of times. A lot of times it's very desaturated. Certain areas might be a little bit more colorful than others, but it's almost always going to be like either mid to the left, and then only certain things will be very bright, perhaps, right? Like flowers and certain things like that, maybe. But there will be times that you need the saturation cranked up. Obviously, it's not unavoidable. Like, but you can do a lot of things that are very nature like earth tones and things like that. Can be very simple, right? So you can color these things. Is all I'm trying to point out now. You know, even like you want brown, it's desaturated orange usually. Okay, so you can see it's like an orangey red, desaturated, and then maybe like a bluish gray here. Do more red. That give us kind of that rocky kind of color, that brown right there, like that. You see, so like this is the magic of working digitally. Like in traditional, you would call this with acrylic paints. You might do a black and white image. You might glaze over the top of it, but that's just transparent paint. So that's like turning the opacity down. And in that case, your tones here or your values here do matter. Like if you're using a bright yellow compared to a dark yellow, that's going to influence this area a lot. So that's how you work with it in traditional. It takes a little while to get used to, and you still might want to do that here in digital as well. And the main reason being is there's other types of layers you can use, or like blend modes you could use. Instead of doing like color, you could do maybe overlay, where overlay will still influence the value of the color. It will still influence what's happening here, right? And so you can see we can kind of like scribble in color if we needed to, which is really easy to do. Now, I wasn't, like I was saying originally, I'm not trying to do a video on coloring an image necessarily, right? But you can see how we can start laying things out and start creating the illusion of rocks. We can start doing this number like this, and then eventually we can start increasing like contrast in areas where needed. We can add highlights if needed as well in certain areas. You see where that goes? Like, so we can do lots of fun stuff like this. We can start to create a whole scene or composition as complex as you want it. It's really not that crazy to do. I'm going to desaturate this though, because I'm not, once again, I was trying not to worry about color here. I guess I'm not desaturating that one. This one maybe. Okay, and so, but in black and white, it's, you know, it's something like this. So the better your image looks in black and white, generally when it goes time to color it, it's going to look even more powerful, basically. You can use concepting brushes in this process. I want to just talk about them real quick. So like if you really want to use like rock brushes to create your rock textures, it's fine. You can do that. The same with like gravel or just general textures like chalk textures or whatever. You can use that at any time. You use cloud brushes, add little birds in the sky, do light rays, those kinds of things with all your concepting brushes. It's fine. Krita doesn't have a lot of them by default. So it's a pack that I was thinking about putting together, getting a bunch of things like that going. But the main thing is that if you find it, like speed art or speed painting is really about finding like what works best for you to get to the end result as fast as you can, but it's not like a polished end result necessarily. Like it can look really good, it can be done very fast, but it's not going to be like a full-on finalized illustration necessarily. It's going to be good enough that you're conveying what the scene is, like what's going on in that scene and how everything is taking place there. And but it's not necessarily like super refined and polished. Like you might still have some rough areas and patches and stuff. When you take something like this and you start it to the points that those other images were at that I showed earlier, or this one now, we can continue to refine this later on, clean up the perspective, make things more proper, break it down into more and more layers if needed. So that way, like every individual object has its own layer perhaps. And then we can do some big paint over type stuff later on as well. Like if we want to use a soft round brush and say there's like a sun all the way back here near this area. You see, like we can start to work out these ideas of lighting and shadows and all kinds of other fun stuff. So we can do fun stuff like this throughout the image later on, and really just spice it up so that it looks nicer. Like maybe you want some like the idea of vignetting in the corners or something, right? Like you can create those like photographic type effects. You can do depth of field, so you can start blurring things in the background as well, perhaps. Always a possibility. And so like you're going to take that image to that next level based off of your quick thumbnail sketch, thumbnail painting, whatever you want to call it. But you can get it started at least and start taking it to that next level, right? So a lot of times whenever I'm doing these like really quick 30-minute sketches and stuff, this is literally what it is. I'm going through this process as fast as I can, trying to lay out an interesting composition, and I'm throwing some cheap thrills on there at the end usually, where it's just like a lens. It's like a little bit of this number going on, right? It just makes it look a little bit nicer, real quick. It's just like a little effect for it, but it's just something I could do that's fun and fast and cheap and easy, right? So, not worrying about color, because, you know, if we started coloring the whole thing, we're going to end up worrying about that instead of worrying about composition and other things that we could be thinking about or doing. And so you see where this all went in 30 minutes. Basically we got a little thing started here. It's not maybe like the greatest thing in the world, but it's started, right? And that's kind of the idea of speed art in general. Is not about creating that maybe final piece right off the bat, but getting something interesting quick. And you know, when you want to go back through and you're like, you know, I need smokestacks, you can do all the other little effects later on, perhaps, where you're trying to create whatever it is you're trying to create here. You know, if you want to do like little clouds and stuff like that, and you can do that. It's all up to you guys. You just got to practice rendering different things, doing studies, having fun with it. It's really up to you to kind of practice these things and study them as well, because like, smoke, for me at least, I got a commission to do a train, right? Like a steam train. I learned a lot about smoke doing a steam train. I got a commission to do like different types of like landscapes and stuff. I learned a lot about doing clouds. So then I had to worry about doing bright areas for like the sun flying through windows and stuff, and all the other fun stuff you learn when you start picking up art and doing it professionally, right? That's what ends up happening. You can start working things out very fast and coming up with the results before you know it. It's like quicker than you think. So the main thing here though is that even if you went through all this process, we're just going to touch on this one at the very end here. This works not just on landscapes, it works on characters, props, vehicles, whatever you want to do. You can still work with the kind of the block-in idea and the values, but a lot of times hard surface stuff starts better with a sketch, right? So back to where we were at the start of this video almost, and when we're sketching something out, we're trying to figure out a shape of something, and we're doing this number, right? You can use a loose sketch like this, drop the opacity if you want, create a new layer, use a hard round brush, go through, cut out the silhouette, right? Make it all enclosed if needed. I'm just going to quickly do this, okay? And you can use line tools too. Don't be afraid of just pressing V and using a line tool. But if you were to do this number like this, you will go ahead and do exactly the same thing we did with the foreground, midground, and background. So we have it all there, we fill it, right? And that's it. Now that sketch, we can put above it maybe, or the fill be below it, if I can get it to work. There you go. Control G it together, create a new layer, alpha lock, or alpha inheritance, should I say? Okay, so now all the sketch won't be outside the silhouette anymore. And now this empty layer that we've created, we can go ahead and just hit it with a gray. You can see our sketch. Let's make it not as apparent. There you go, turn the opacity down. And then we can use a square tip marker, round tip marker, whatever you want to use. You can use round. By the way, I've modified most of my brushes here. They're just slightly different. I'm going to probably more than likely be changing, like in this case of this one, I changed it so that it's a sharper, it's a harder brush basically. It's not like a medium hardness brush. At least I thought it did. It might be still the same settings, who knows. But other ones are going to be like, I'm just playing with curves a lot of times, like opacity curves, you know? So it's the same soft round brush here, different curves, so that it behaves like a pencil set. So you have like hard lead, soft lead, that kind of deal. But the brush tip itself, still soft round brush, precision's up, pressure sensitive size only like this. I don't take it down all the way low. A lot of times I do like a 50 or 60%. on some brushes anyways. Other times you don't want that at all, so don't do that. So, learn to tweak and modify your brushes, have fun with it, do that. But you want to learn to modify them, but also modify them on the fly as well. Like learn to change that opacity, change your size a lot. So you shift dragging, in Krita, quite useful. You can do this all day long. It's no problem. And so the only reason I wanted to go over this little section here is because we can do material breakup as well with these values. So we can change like the materials with different values. Okay. So this is just something I wanted to hit you guys with because a lot of you like hard surface. You can see it, something like that's acceptable, right? So, I mean, it's very easy to come up with these kinds of ideas and designs. Like if I started using pure black, that'd probably not be a good idea. But if we had like some kind of like weird rubber in here or something, we could possibly do that. And we could add lighting, more proper lighting on things later on, doing shadow rays and all that other fun stuff. But, I don't know. What are we making here? I don't like that little idea there. I thought that was going to work out different. So we'll get rid of it. But you get the idea, like we can start going through this now and just having fun playing with the design, doing blocking. We did an initial sketch, which already got us quite a bit farther, right? That initial sketch. It's very loose, very fast, but it's something like that, right? Like your artworks, once you get the hang of them and creating them in certain processes, they become easier to create and faster, especially after doing studies, right? You need to study everything that you're interested in. And it's not always what you think that you're interested in. Like you're trying to create biomech robots. You don't just look at biomech robots other people have created necessarily. You might do a study on some of them, sure. But the main thing is that you're probably going to start looking at like real world creatures like ants and bees and other things like crustaceans, and start figuring out like how you can turn animals into perhaps like biomech robots or different little pieces of anatomy you can use in your designs and whatnot. And then mixed with hard surface stuff. So you're looking at like whatever, like robots, cars, and things like that, airplanes. So, you can do this all day long. Just start to work it out. Very fun, easy to do. And I'll leave it up to you from here. I mean, really, this should be getting you kind of excited to do artwork, I hope. That's the main reason I did this video. Is even though, I don't usually try to push like the final illustration a lot these days because it's just, I'd rather go to 3D and start blocking out in Blender and doing a render so I don't have to worry about doing all the shadowing and stuff manually. So, concept artists today, they work a lot in 3D as well. They might do simple blockouts and then kind of like photo bash / illustrate over the top of it. But sometimes they do full on renders and then kind of use those renders as a starting point for like a paint over, perhaps. They might split it into layers. There's actually a way to create your renders as layers as well. It's really kind of interesting. But I have to look more into that one because I haven't played around with that one enough myself. I just seen it the other day. I was like, man, probably should have been doing this for a while. But you know what? That's what happens as you do more and more art. You realize that there's always cooler and different techniques and tricks that you can utilize perhaps later on and whatnot. So you can see this whole thing moves inside there. So moves a group perhaps. But if we needed a subject somewhere, some kind of wherever, we have it now, right? And so that's pretty much it for this video, guys. Hopefully, suddenly art should be kind of exciting, like it's not as hard as you think it is. Like you use those composition guides or perspective guides, excuse me. You play around with the composition, the values. You start creating interesting breakups at different ratios, like that whole 70-20-10 kind of rule. You do the same thing on everything you create, whether it's the factory in the background, the light poles, or the rocks, or the way how much space the sun takes up. You're thinking about percentages of how much space this occupies, where you're leading the viewer's eye in the scene and everything else. It's a lot of fun, right? And it's not as hard as you think it is. Like all those ideas are like symmetry and balance and repetition, all the design fundamentals, art fundamentals, all the painting kind of ideas, like working background, foreground, and midground, all start to come out right here, and they kind of make a lot more sense. And then you apply all of that to your 3D as well when you're creating shapes, right? And forms, and you're creating robots and whatever else you're creating. You still apply those, like, break things into thirds maybe, or whatever the case, right? Try out different compositions of the shapes and high frequency detail with low frequency, like white space. There's just nothing going on in certain areas, right? Give the eye some room to breathe a little bit, and then it all comes together, guys. And this applies not only in 3D, animation, VFX, it applies in photography, traditional arts, painting, Yeah, it's all over. It's everywhere. Even in like if you're doing like videography, you know, you can use all the art fundamentals there as well. So all the visual arts are tied together with those fundamentals usually. And that's when you learn those, it empowers you to do all the other stuff you ever wanted to do for the most part, right? That's why I keep hounding away at this, because you don't have to always feel like one day you're going to be good. I've seen a lot of guys doing this to themselves. It's not good to have that mindset that like you can't do or achieve these things. When you see those professional artists working and creating really great things, yeah, they spend a lot of time practicing and maybe doing studies on characters and things like that, or landscapes, and great. But you can do it. It's just a process you go through to get to that point where you can do it. Like you study landscape, you study drawing in perspective, you study these things. And at a certain point, you combine all this together and then you suddenly look like you're some phenomenal artist when you're just a trained artist, right? It's not a natural given talent for everybody. They just get training and they practice. And the guys that don't take the time to do this stuff that's not fun, like drawing in perspective practice, it's not fun, but it's something you need to practice because you're going to use it every time you do an art piece. And it's something you got to practice. So yeah, anyways, so I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll check you guys out in the next one. All right, take care.